Alaska, a land of endless snow and breathtaking beauty. But behind its frozen silence, there are stories that were never meant to be told. Tonight, you'll hear two of the most disturbing true horror stories from the Alaskan wilderness. Encounters so chilling, they've left survivors haunted forever. From a mysterious call that should never have happened, to a photographer's nightmare under the northern lights. These are not legends. These are true events. And once you hear them, you'll never look at Alaska the same way again. They call Alaska the last frontier because it takes what it wants and asks no one for permission. Good evening. My name is Sarah, and I used to answer the calls you never want to get. For 15 years, I worked dispatch in Fairbanks winter shifts that stretch into a kind of permanent night, where the cold eats the edges off your thoughts and the radios carry voices like ghosts across the tundra. I thought I had heard everything. Then came the call from Dmitry Volov, and nothing afterwards sounded the same. It was one of those January nights where the heat in the building makes your ears pop and the world beyond the windows feels like a different dimension. The thermometer had sat below -30 for 2 weeks. People who had sense were already indoors. The console was quiet, too quiet, with only the low hum of electronics and the occasional static burst from a distant unit. I was halfway through a lukewarm coffee when the line lit up. 2:17 a.m. 911. What's your emergency? I answered, the practiced voice that makes strangers tell you everything. The voice on the other end was calm, not frantic. It's not slurred. Calm in the way of someone reading a statement into a ledger. My name is Dmitry Volov. I am dead. There is a place in your chest that tightens when you shouldn't. Say the words, I am dead, back to someone who still breathes. I remember standing, coffee forgotten, feeling the room tilt. Sir, repeat that. Are you hurt? Where are you calling from? Mile marker 47, off the Dalton, my cabin. I have been dead 3 days. At first I thought it was a bad prank. We get those? Drunks, bored kids with scanners, people who want to hear themselves on the line. But his voice didn't line up with a prank. It was precise, even measured. It had the cadence of someone who had rehearsed saying the words but not to be funny. He said them like he was stating facts. I pulled his name across our database, fingers moving on muscle memory. Dmitry Volov registered. Age. Single, no emergency contacts. Address. Remote cabin. Winter road, not plowed. No neighbors for miles. There was already a welfare check flagged 2 days prior. A neighbor had worried when smoke stopped rising from the chimney. They'd called us, then followed up. We had put a file on it because in Alaska, when a chimney falls quiet, you don't ignore it. Stay with me, I said.
Tell me.
What you see. I can see my body, he said. I'm standing in the kitchen looking out. The axe is still in my right hand. Snow on my face. The ravens found it this morning. He started with the eyes. Those details should have broken him. Instead, he spoke them with an almost bureaucratic calm, the words like entries in a ledger. I can still hear the flatness. You're alive if you're talking to me, I told him. Someone's on the way. Tell me any landmarks, anything that helps us find you. He gave me mile markers, the old mining spur, the blue metal roof. He described a rusted mailbox and a broken fence post sunk in half the way down the drive. While he spoke, I dispatched the closest patrol, calculated travel time against the condition of the road, checked coordinates. We're 40 minutes out under the best conditions. Tonight that would be longer. There was a thin noise in the background of the cola wet rattling breath that crawled into your ears. Not speaking, not human breathing that matched the voice, more like air dragging through something that had lost structure. I asked about it. He dismissed it. That's just the wind, he said. But none of it fit. The cadence, the description, way he said he could see his corpse, these were red flags that kept pulling at the edges of my training. And then, after 37 minutes on the line, he said something that made my hands go numb. They're here now. The line slipped into white noise and then into a silence. That sounded like someone had reached into the phone and pressed the world mute. I called his name into the void. I called Unit 12 for an update. Time slowed. The unit came on the radio with a voice that had been forced into work mode, the tones thin through the static. They'd found the cabin. They were walking in. Doors open, the officer said. There's a male. Deceased, been dead a few days, frozen solid. No snow on the porch. No signs of struggle. Generator out. Phone lines. Dead. Dead. The word on the radio landed like a whetstone. There was no phone in use, no battery power. Oh, no lights. The house was as silent as the rest of the landscape, and yet we had been talking to someone who insisted he had been standing in his kitchen, watching his own body. We logged everything. The coroner came, stamped the paperwork, and the world spun a little less bright for a while. The records show a welfare call, a found body, an official cause, cardiac arrest. What the papers do not capture were the 47 screens of notes I typed while Dimitri spoke. The cadence of his voice, the strange background noise, the exact way he said, "I can feel ice water in my veins," and then went on to describe how the raven had pecked at the eyes after the snow had drifted into deep mounds. I must have reread those notes a dozen times over the following days, as if the act of rereading might re-illuminate a logical explanation I had missed. After that night, I worked one more shift and then asked for a transfer. I told myself I was tired. The truth was more awkward and smaller and bigger at the same time. I could not sit in a dark room and hear voices that did not belong to the living without thinking something would call to me, too. Even now, when I drive past Talkeetna, when the sky has that particular glare and the wind smells like metal, I catch myself glancing at the satellite. It is in the old wooden cabins and wondering how many voices are still on the line whispering their coordinates into a world that can pick up the call. But Dimitri was only the beginning. There are patterns you start to see after you work in dispatch long enough. People who vanish alone, the habits of weather that seem almost intentional in how they cover tracks the small animal. Signs that scream at you in a way people rarely notice, stiffened fur animals that will not approach a particular spot, ravens who take an interest as if they are cataloging something beyond scavenging. Those details were in the call and in the field report and later in my dreams. A week after Dimitri, we received a different kind of report, a satellite check-in that stopped. Photographer who had been alone at an abandoned camp. Messages that suggested the camera had been taking pictures without human input. The thread that connected these incidents was tenuous. Different people, different places, but a particular quality whispered through each. Observation, not violence, not malice. An attention that was patient and methodical, like a thing studying the edges of our perception. The next call I will tell you about came from someone who had spent decades in Alaska's backcountry. A wildlife photographer named Isabella, sharp-eyed, the kind of person who interpreted a shift of snow not just as weather, but as a sentence. What she sent back from her solo expedition made my jaw ache the way Dimitri's call had. The camera, she said, was seeing something her eyes could not. She sent images, thousands of them, a slow accumulation of presence in the frame that never appeared when she looked up. The photos made you feel like she had opened a door and something was peeking through the crack. When she began to report the strange timestamps, photos taken while she slept, frames of the inside of her cabin at 2 a.m, showing tall, thin silhouettes at the bunk, she sounded exhausted but not hysterical. Professionals don't dress themselves in hysteria over artifacts. They collect them, document them, and bring them back like evidence of a truth that doesn't want to be acknowledged. I will tell you what her photos looked like. I will tell you why the numbers on the timestamps matter, and why a single, ordinary object in one shot made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But first, I want you to imagine how it feels to hear a voice tell you, calmly and plainly, that he is dead while he watches his own corpse through a window that seems to belong to another world. Hold that thought. Breathe. Keep listening. The second voice you hear in a dispatch center is never the same as the first. When Isabella called in her last message, it carried a different weight, less personal, or clinical, like a researcher reporting an anomaly. Her work had always been about catching what others missed. She told stories about light in winter that made ice look like glass cut open, about caribou that moved like a living shadow across the tundra, about storms that sculpted silence as if anyone could step through and not be noticed. But what she sent from the Wrangell Mountains was not wildlife at all. She arrived at an abandoned mining camp with the kind of gear that would make a layman think she'd planned an expedition to Mars. Layers, battery packs, motion triggers, a professional camera that would see subtleties our eyes cannot. She checked in on day 1 with a brief text. Arrived. Cabin secure. Temp -32. Light is unreal. Day 2, ice formations near the mine mouth. Time-lapse running. Day 3. Something in the shots that is not ice. Reviewing. The messages came later and later each evening. A small red flag that I'm now trained to notice. She sent a clip of a time-lapse where frost built on the edges of an old wheel. When you watch it at the right speed, you see a suggestion of shape forming in the corner of the frame. Nothing definite, but enough to make you tilt your head like an animal sensing a stranger's scent. By day 6, her tone had shifted. She wasn't afraid. She was puzzled in a way that made your skin tighten. "The camera sees them," she wrote. "They don't appear to the eye. But they are here, in the frames, moving when I look away." She described photos that appeared with timestamps while she slept. Interiors shot from angles she had not set up. Someone, or something, was using her own equipment to observe her. Tom, the bush pilot, who dropped her in, agreed to do a flyover when weather permitted. From the air, the cabin looked the way it had the first day, no footprints beyond those she'd left. Smoke from the chimney when conditions allowed, gear neatly stacked outside. But to a photographer like Isabella, a flyover does not erase the oddity of 847 new photos taken by a motion trigger between midnight and dawn, all showing silhouettes at the edge of the lens. When she described the shapes, they were frustratingly non-specific, thin, several in number, sometimes closer to the camera than the tree line, sometimes framed half in and half out like a pair of hands reaching toward a window. The oddest detail was how they appeared only in certain exposures, only under certain shutter speeds, only when light hit them in a very particular way. They existed on a spectrum of visibility that your eye could not occupy. The camera lived there, and now so did she. Her last transmission was different. There is a kind of exhaustion at professional reports when they have finally run out of instruments. When facts stop accumulating and what remains is a pattern you cannot yet name, she wrote. They are not hostile. They are curious. When I show them the photos, they seem to inspect the image. They want to be seen. Imagine that something that has been invisible for decades learning the joy of being noticed. Imagine turning a lens on a thing and then watching the thing turn its attention back at you. That shift is not violence, it is recognition.
Oh.
And recognition in the deep quiet of the Arctic can be dangerous because it invites interaction. On the morning Tom flew back, the cabin looked intact from above. The pilot radioed down that he saw signs of her presence gear, tracks going to the outhouse, then called that landing was impossible. Weather turned, as it does in Alaska, with a cruelty that is almost indifferent. He promised to return when safe. Isabella's last message came 2 days later. "I have been reviewing all my shots. The figures multiply when I'm not looking. They are near the camera now. I'm leaving the lens open to see if they approach it. If I disappear, look at the timestamps." When she didn't check in, someone I trusted went out. Search and rescue kicked into the slow, methodical rhythm that keeps bodies from being lost forever. They reached the cabin 2 days after the last message. There was no sign of struggle. The bed was made, food was stacked. The camera sat where she left it. The battery packs had been drained, but the memory cards were full. One of the photographers on the team loaded the cards onto a laptop and began paging through shot after shot. What they found is the kind of thing you keep to yourself at first because you worry people will call you a liar or worse, a fool. In hundreds of exposures, there were images of empty landscape, and then more and more there would be figures appearing in the frames, looking at the cabin, looking at the equipment. One sequence showed 3 silhouettes at the tree line, heads cocked as if watching someone move inside. Another showed a shadow right at the edge of a porch shot, blurred and hungry for the lens. There were also photos taken at timestamps when Isabella was logged into a video call with her editor. The camera had evidently been triggered remotely or by motion while she slept. The images showed the inside of the cabin at 2 a.m, with tall, lean shapes standing around the bunk, looking down. The camera captured angles that no one inside the room would have had time to set up. The more you look, the more the pictures itch at your brain the way a dream that won't reveal its punchline does. No one could explain the mechanics. No one could confirm whether these were creatures, ghosts, or some phenomenon of light that emerged at certain temperatures. The scientists argued. The local elders offered older names that did not translate cleanly, but hinted at things meant to watch and not be watched. What felt true was not a name but a behavior. They were curious. They interacted with light in a way that suggested they wanted a reflection. a record proof that they existed in a world that could hold them. I'll be honest, when I first saw those images on the return briefing, the same flat wash of disbelief you feel when someone tells you a crazy story ran across my skin. But then I remembered Dimitri on the line telling me the ravens had pecked his eyes. Then I thought of the neighbor who swore she heard someone humming, low and slow, outside in the freeze. Those small, seemingly unrelated details started to stitch together. We filed the report as a missing person turned unresolved disappearance. We brought back the memory cards to evidence. They sat under chain of custody, behind floors and locks, until the coroner and the research team could argue in measured tones about exposure, camera artifacts, and the limits of human perception. Meanwhile, in dispatch, those images got their own life among folks who work nights. We trade stories, pass along warnings. People learn how not to be alone in certain places and how to respect the boundaries of nature's darker corners. But there's another element that bothered me more than pictures: the engagement. Both Dimitri and Isabella had been watched. One answered us from the kitchen while his dead body lay behind him. The other brought back where a camera could see those watching and the watchers could see her. In each account, attention was the lever. Someone or something turned its notice toward a human object and then waited to see what the human would do. That idea lodged into the station like a stone in your shoe. Attention is not harmless. It is directional. It moves things. And if you're the kind of person who goes into the void to see what's there, understand this. Sometimes what looks back is patient, and what waits for you is not cruel in a way you recognize, but it is indifferent to your being. I could have left it there, the 2 reports cold and filed. A pair of unsettling anomalies that I might read again and then set aside. But the pattern did not stop. Calls kept coming. There were pilots who reported lights moving against the wind. Hunters who found their dogs staring into empty hilltops and refusing to pass. And a supply plane that recorded a voice on a channel no one had been broadcasting on. Every time, the narrative bent toward the same concern. There is a presence at the edge of perception that does not follow our rules. When you listen to enough of those edges, they begin to hum together. They make a chord you can't unhear. After Isabella's disappearance, the tone in the station changed in small ways that are hard to describe unless you VA worked nights. People started to double-check their gear before heading outdoors. The line between professional caution and superstition is thin, and we all crossed it without noticing. We set up protocols for checking in, longer windows before we call search and rescue. Small rituals that felt like paperwork but were really attempts to anchor ourselves in a world that had shown us a crack. The next incident came from a place you'd call ordinary if you'd never lived. There an old miner named Henry who ran a trapline near an abandoned rail spur. He was not a man given to exaggeration. He had earned a crust of life out of hard places and had a way of speaking that made you trust his judgments. Henry called the station 3 nights after a pilot reported seeing strange lights over a ridge. He was breathing hard on the line when I picked up. "There's a light on the hill," he said. "It's not a fox. It don't move right. It keeps watching." "What does it look like?" I asked. "Like a woman with a lantern, except the lantern ain't the problem. It's the way she don't cast no reflection on the snow. It's the dogs. My dogs won't go near her. Dogs are experts at sensing things we can't. When multiple canines refuse a spot, you pay attention." He sent someone to check. The officer found footprints leading to the edge of the tree line, then stopping abruptly, as though someone had stepped out of the world. The officer felt the skin tingle people describe when they stand on the lip of something very old. He came back on the radio and said, "Only we see nothing now. There's a weirdness to the snow, like it was brushed, but no prints leading back. The dogs wouldn't go." At the same time, the pilot, who had done the flyover near Isabella, reported a voice on an emergency frequency. A recording was pulled. The voice was low and slow, rhythmic, the kind of inhalation and exhalation that made you think of a wind instrument played badly. It seemed to wrap words inside it, words that could have been language, or could have been the wind pretending to be speech. Is it possible for a radio to pick up echoes of something in the atmosphere? Sure, but the tone line matched several other reports across the same month and the same region. Patterns accumulate not because each one is convincing on its own, but because they start to resonate. They begin to make the same strange music. Each new small note makes the chord heavier. Something was structuring attention across multiple sites. That was the terrifying inference. Not just a single anomaly, but coordination. We invited a research team to review the data. Scientists do what scientists do. They propose hypotheses, run through the possible natural explanations, and test what can be tested. They concluded some occurrences could be explained by optical artifact-sized crystals catching light in precise ways. Camera shutters, doing odd things in extreme cold, but not all of it fit. Animals behaved as if something was there, walks interrupted, birds refusing to land, dogs staring until their noses bled. That level of behavioral consistency among non-human observers is the kind of data that makes you pause. Then there was the call that now sits in my memory like a photograph taken in the dark. It came from a pilot named Tom who had been ferrying supplies between McCarthy and a remote station. He was young, competent, and not prone to flights of fancy. "Sarah," he said, voice tight. I heard a voice on the emergency channel. Not spoken words, but a description. Like someone cataloging what I was carrying. Cataloging, I repeated. Like reading an inventory out loud under his breath. First, he named the packages by their contents, and then he said a name that sounded like mine. The pilot was rattled. He sent the recording. The sound was a low, throaty hum underneath the hiss of static. In the center of it, you could hear human syllables, names, objects, coordinates, not arranged like a conversation, but like a ledger being read aloud to whatever was listening. What frightened us most was not the content, but the implication. Someone, or something, had an awareness of our logistics, our supply chains. That kind of attention is not accidental. It is focus. Focus implies purpose. There is a difference between being seen and being studied. Hunters and pilots and photographers are not prey in the sense of being hunted by appetite. These cases suggested observation for reasons that don't align with hunger. The pattern suggested a record-keeping impulse. Names, objects, dates, the things that make human life legible. It was as if the land had become a slow archivist, collecting the details of our comings and goings. We tried to respond with protocol, set up check-in times. We advised people not to go out alone in certain sectors. We recommended leaving cameras on motion triggers pointed outward rather than at tents. We taught people to note whether their dogs refused to approach certain places. All of this felt like arranging deck chairs on a ship you could not see the hull of. Still, each small action rescued lives. Each small action created more data. And then the calls came in clusters. A trapper who swore his foxes vanished in a ring. A pilot who recorded lights that moved against the wind, like a school of fish weaving through a current they did not belong to. One dispatcher who heard someone humming a lullaby across an open channel at 3 a.m. That particular humming, low, slow, and oddly precise, was the same intonation that had been faint in the background of Demetria's last words. At night in the barracks, the crew would trade stories and whispers, checking each other's mental currency. "Did you hear about the woman with the lantern?" someone would ask. Nod and tell your own small horror. There's a social function to telling these stories. It keeps one's edges from fraying in isolation. But the stories deepened into a communal sense that the land had shifted in some ineffable way. The idea that the cold preserved more than blood, preserved attention, or memory began to look less absurd. Sometimes people assume these are supernatural explanations because it's the simplest frame to hold. That's lazy thinking. There are always multiple ways to interpret strange data. But whether you call it supernatural, environmental, or a glitch in the way reality arranges itself at extreme temperatures, the effect is the same. Things happen that leave you with less certainty than you had the day before. The Alaska I had known became a place where the margin between what you could see and what the camera could reveal thinned into a bruise. And through it all, the pattern tightened around observation. Voices on deadlines, cameras taking pictures without hands, dogs refusing places, lights that did not obey wind, and recordings that whispered names. That insistence on looking and cataloging, on standing on the edge of vision and making note of what steps across it, is what had become the common thread. If there is a rule to keep in mind when you enter those places, it is this: do not assume curiosity is innocent. In certain places, attention itself can be contagious, and once noticed, the noticed begin to change. They told us to treat these incidents as isolated statistical outliers in a place where misfortune and the environment conspire against people. Paperwork makes anomalies feel manageable. We logged reports, filed evidence, and fed the files into systems meant to track missing persons and unusual phenomena. Yet the human element resisted closure. Families asked for explanations. Colleagues wanted to know if they had missed something. I wanted to know if there was a way to measure the moral weight of being watched. Several months after Isabella vanished, another strange event arrived on the station line. This one small and domestic, and impossibly intimate. An elderly woman named Merritt called from a cabin near a lake and said simply, "There's someone singing outside my window. He knows my name." Merritt had a voice like gravel and tea. She had lived there 40 years and had never called for anything less than medical aid. The operator who recorded the call described a low melodic hum, a cadence like a lullaby in a language that did not quite map to modern words. And in the middle of it, a syllable that was Merritt's maiden name. We tried to trace the sound. There was no one outside, no footprints in the snow. The dog slept as if unbothered, and yet Merritt was certain. She said the singing felt like a tension, like a hand on the back of your neck you can't quite make out. We sent someone to stand outside and listen. Nothing. The silence pressed like a lid. But Merritt would not be consoled by the absence of proof. She paced her floor at night, and when I called back the next day, she answered with a voice that had new lines in it. "They sing to the houses that remember," she said. "They call the names of things that used to live here." I kept thinking of the ledger-like voice that catalogued a pilot's cargo, and of Dmitri calmly listing the condition of his body. Cataloging, remembering, singing, these are small, human acts of attention. They are how we make the world legible. If something else develops that habit, it will begin to peek into our structures and read our margin notes. That is the scariest part. You live your life, you write your calendar, you build your map, and then something else reads the map like a script. Some tried to ritualize defense. People placed mirrors on porches to see if reflection confused whatever watched. Left radios untuned to static-heavy channels, and burned small offerings of tobacco or tea as if to buy time with the landscape. Folklore met protocol. Part of me was embarrassed by it, paper and trinkets in the face of an unknown. But each small ritual had a practical second effect. It made people look at their surroundings differently. Sometimes looking differently is enough to alter outcomes by degrees. We started advising people to keep spare batteries charged, to leave shallow bowls of water near doorways, and to note whether animals behaved abnormally. It felt ridiculous to reduce complex phenomena to checklists, but those checklists saved someone the day a truck failed, and they had to wait in a 3-hour frost for rescue. The practical and the surreal braided together because in extreme places survival requires both. One of the more disturbing follow-ups came from forensic analysis of the images recovered from Isabella's camera. A lab technician found refractive artifacts in several frames that suggested something was bending light at angles we cannot normally observe. The scientist assigned hedged his conclusions in technical terms: optical scattering under phase change conditions, lens flare weirdness enhanced by crystalline substructures, but the upshot was that at extreme temperatures and specific humidity levels, ice can behave like a prism the size of a man. That gave some people a way to explain the silhouettes. For others, it was insufficient. If ice bends light into the shape of a person, that still did not explain why dogs refused certain places, and why a pilot heard his name on a channel with no transmitter. You learn after a while that some questions do not resolve. They fold into other questions. You pile more observation on top of observation and see whether patterns hold. In my years on the night shift, I saw that people react to being watched in consistent ways. They pull in. They assume smaller paths. They leave the lights on. They also become more careful about what they document, who they tell, and what they record. Perhaps that is the most useful lesson these stories taught me. Attention is reciprocal. When you look, you may become part of what looks back. In the months and years after those incidents, the calls decreased. Not because whatever held that attention went away, but because people adapted. They traveled in groups, adjusted departure times. They brought extra batteries, and a greater willingness to accept that the world might have things in it that don't follow our categories. The pattern didn't end. It receded into a condition people learned to live alongside. But Dimitri's voice? Flat. Lucid. stating the facts of his own decay, comes back to me sometimes at red lights or in conversations where someone talks about the cold and how it holds shape. I still have those 47 screens of notes I took while he spoke. I read them sometimes like one reads an old letter, looking for an ink blot that will make the rest of the page make sense. I've never found it. If there is a moral to this, it is not comforting. The world has edges where our categories thin. In some places, the land not only preserves bodies, it catalogs them. It watches. It remembers. It names. And when you wander into those parts of the map, it's possible you will be noted by whatever keeps those records. So, if you ever find yourself in a place where the snow looks too neat, where the dogs won't go, or a camera shows you a stranger you did not photograph, remember, attention can be contagious. The safest thing is to leave the land to its memory. If you must step into the cold, go with others. Keep your devices charged, and never, ever assume curiosity is harmless. Because sometimes when you answer the phone in the middle of the night, the voice at the other end will tell you they are dead and they will sound perfectly calm about it. They say the North changes you. Not in the polite, metaphorical way people use when they talk about travel. The North takes away the small things first. The ability to hear your own breath without it sounding like wind. The names of towns you once loved. The reason you crossed a frozen river at midnight. Then it moves on to the larger things. Patience. Certainty. The little assumptions that make a life feel safe. By the time it's finished, you are someone else standing in a place that has always been here, indifferent to your disappearance.
My name is Isabella.
I've spent a decade making a living out of light and distance. Wolves at dawn.
Caribou lines on the tundra, the exact way the aurora folds like a curtain and lets you peek behind it for a second. Photographers call it chasing the light. I called it work.
Yes.
Last March, I chased light into the Brooks Range with a team of 4 and came home with hundreds of photographs that didn't belong to this world. We flew in light, a bush plane, and a man who smelled of cold coffee and old cotton. Jake, our guide, had hands like a mechanic and a smile that told you he didn't mind being uncomfortable. Sarah was our assistant, meticulous with batteries and lens caps. Mike handled the electronics and the heavy gear. The plan was simple. Set up time-lapse cameras, pick a stable ridge near a frozen river, and wait a week for the aurora to do what it does best. Make the sky move. The first 2 nights were textbook beautiful. The aurora came like a curtain of green and violet, reshaping the horizon, painting the river glass. We shot in shifts. We ate coffee and dried fruit. We joked about superstition and stories of miners who disappeared in summer storms. At 2 a.m., the sky would spill, and we'd put the cameras into long exposures and feel like gods, recording centuries in frames. On the second night, I reviewed my photos and felt something like vertigo. At first, I thought it was fatigue, a trick of the sensor. In the foreground of one image, near a snowbank that had been a simple mound at midnight, there stood something crystalline and vertical, like a shard of the sky, had fallen and taken a human outline with it. It was humanoid enough to make my stomach drop. It had shoulders, the suggestion of arms, but no face. Just a smooth, glassy plane, reflecting nothing, not even light. I checked the lens for condensation, the sensor for marks. Nothing. The timestamp was correct. No smudges, no glitch. I showed the frame to Jake, a joke for us, until his laugh stopped halfway. Probably a trick of the light, he said, and I heard the uncertainty in his voice, even as he tried to reassure us. We put another camera on the same spot, tightened tripod legs into ice, angled lenses like watchmen. Morning photography made the anomaly creep into the day. The next files showed more figures. To now, standing farther out, not where footprints should be. Not where shadows should fall. They were closer to the tree line. They looked like the negative of a photograph, edges crisp. Insides made of the same blue-white the northern sky sometimes makes when it forgets where it ends. The week unspooled into smaller, stranger increments. Radios picked up static that sounded like whispered syllables. At night, something walked the ring of our camp. You learn a place by its sounds. The creak of frozen tent flaps, the distant waterfall's low hum under the ice, the crack of ice under fox paws. These sounds are reliable. They repeat, so you can learn to sleep through them. The new sound circled the tent and did not belong to any animal I knew. It was deliberate, a slow padding like someone who had not yet learned how to walk on snow. We kept shooting. At is what I could do when my chest felt like someone else's chest, point a lens, and name what I could see. The cameras revealed what our eyes could not. In the first hours, they were ghost-light, ambiguous. By day 5, the forms elongated. They began to tilt toward us, in sequences, like an audience learning to focus on a play. My heart sharpened every time I downloaded the memory card. What we caught was not static, it responded. Photographs taken at dawn, noon, and dusk showed the figures in different arrangements, closer each time, but only in the frames. None of us had ever seen them in person. Jake swore he glimpsed one in the real world on night 6. He stood with a thermos, staring at some black point beyond the ridge, and said he saw movement as if the air itself had stepped. He described it like a person turning away into the aurora. He would not go near the bank. He said the air tasted different. I tasted it too once, metallic and thin, and my mouth filled with the sense that we had trespassed somewhere delicate. On the 7th night, weather turned to a bruise across the sky. Wind, sleet, a confusion of visibility. We retreated into the tents like people trying to hold a secret. Sleep was impossible, not because of fear. At first it was because of the cameras. One camera had a motion trigger. In the morning, it beeped through the batteried night like an alarm. The preview showed a figure inches from the lens, its faceless head tilted in a way that implied curiosity. The image was horrifyingly calm. It didn't lunge. It didn't reach. It only stood there, as if someone had come to study the instrument we used to look at them. That night, the storm pinched the ridge into quiet. The wind did not howl so much as press. Tent zippers froze. We decided to pack and leave at first light. The plane would take us away from the place, away from the questions. The gear came down, hands raw from cold. We lashed tripods and rolled camera backpacks under rough straps. We moved like people who have rehearsed an exit. Quick, practiced, not drawn out. It felt like leaving a theater after the climax, except the stage still had actors on it, and they were looking at the exit. We were trapped. The storm held. Cue, when it came late, like a delayed mercy. The pilot said the storm had carved the world into unreachable pieces. We were found 2 days later by a search pilot who skirted the worst and spotted footprints where no footprints should have been. I remember waking with my fingers frozen to my camera and the way the pilot's face looked when he said, "Are you alone?" I could not process the question because machine logic requires the counting of bodies, and we had 4 people who had gone in and only one who came out with her camera and enough sense to answer. My team was gone. No tracks trailed away. No struggle. No bodies. Searchers combed the area. They brought dogs that would not approach a half-mile range from the camp. They said the snow had altered the track lines. But snow doesn't eat a person. Snow is a fossilizer. It keeps and keeps, stubborn and slow. When the search teams expanded, they found photographs in a neat pile on a tripod, still recording. Thousands of images, hundreds of frames from the night. In many of those frames, the crystalline figures had become worse. Not violent, not at all. They had positioned around the tents like an audience framing a stage. When people hear the word evidence, they imagine a clear chain, proofs laid down like stones across the river of doubt. My evidence came as a burden instead. It arrived on thumb drives and memory cards in a plastic bag that smelled faintly of diesel and too long exposure. The files were organized into folders that read like days. The metadata was immaculate. Camera model, exposure length, UTC timestamps that did not lie. But photographs don't tell why, they only tell what. And what they told me was chilling. The first thing the analyst said in neutral tones was this: "We've never seen data like this." They were polite. They wore physics in their mannerisms and asked for the cameras to be shipped with care. A lab in Anchorage ran the sensors and declared them free of tampering. The cameras had not been hacked. The images had not been edited. The sensors recorded wavelengths that the naked eye could not perceive. They scanned the frames and called the shapes anomalous reflectance features because scientists are sometimes allergic to poetic words. In layman's terms, the cameras had picked up subtle bands of light from a spectrum we don't normally use for photography. Light the camera could see, but my eyes could not. Journalists smelled a story and came with notebooks and overused metaphors. Ghosts of the ice, oral apparitions. The more the story brewed in the public, the more firmly I wanted to hold it behind glass. For every person who wanted the mystery to be aliens or ancient spirits, there were others who offered previous examples. Unexplained phenomenon in mining camps, spectral sightings around thawed tundra, and so on. The internet is an anthill of theory. Lives are built on it. But none of it fit the frames that showed my Team S outlines, the exact slouch of Jake. The way Sarah curled a thumb when nervous, Mike's habit of leaning his head on one shoulder. The figures were becoming imitators, and imitation is a more dangerous thing than menace. Imitation implies learning. Authorities filed an official report asking for extra time to investigate displaced persons. They checked our itinerary, our permits. They combed my social media for hints of mental instabilities. Aoife collected statements and sorted emails into folders with surgical care. She did what sisters do when someone else's life slides off the rails. She attempted to resurrect small facts. What did you eat that day? Who brought the chocolate? Did anyone complain about a camera? Did you drink? Questions that seemed normal? I answered them as though they were scales under which a larger truth could balance. A specialist in electromagnetic phenomena from a university camp visited. He ran tests in the photographs and explained, with a measured voice, that certain crystalline structures can diffract light in ways that mimic human shapes. He gave me articles, explained the aurora as a charged wind, particles dancing. He said nothing about imitation. When I asked him about patterns, how the figures learned to stand with shoulders like ours, he smiled like someone considering a puzzle. If something in the environment can interact with man-made objects, cameras, tripods, clothing, perhaps it can map them. Cameras are mapping devices. They don't always work the way we expect. This is where the story slickly splits into two audiences: those who accept anomaly, and those who reassign it to known categories. I wanted a middle position, which is to say, I wanted the truth. Maybe the truth is an unruly animal that is part scientist and part dream. Maybe the truth is both mundane and monstrous. In my kitchen at home, with Aoife brewing tea and drawing lines on a paper map, the photographs looked more like a language than they did like aberrations. If you looked closely enough, you could see sequence in the frames. The figures turned their heads in a way that matched a human turning to look at a sound. Once when I slept in the if the figures had been content to exist in frames and on the edge of a sky, perhaps we would have defined them as a kind of atmospheric curiosity. But the thing that matters with dark things is not their existence, but their intention. Intention implies direction. Direction implies you can aim your fear at a thing and know how it will move. The forms in my photographs behaved differently. Their intention was not hostile in any conventional sense. It was curious. It's curiosity, when focused on human beings, is sometimes the first stage before other things. Replication, mimicry, substitution. I attempted to reconstruct the week with more precision. I built a timeline that could be read like a shooting script. Setup: first anomaly, increased frequency, tactile sound at night, motion trigger alert, storm, disappearance. I traveled back to the ridge 3 months later with permission and a small, careful team. Authorities were reluctant to allow fresh equipment, worried we would contaminate something they had not yet cataloged. I asked for only one camera and a technician who understood how to secure the site without adding foreign variables. The climb up felt like stepping onto a stage that had been left mid-play. The tents were gone. The ground had healed with fresh snow and moss where we had trampled. Triangulation points matched my old photos with eerie exactness. We placed the camera where the initial figure had been and left it recording in a slow, deliberate loop. Instruments hummed, set a motion trigger, and then I waited in the cold in a tent, a safe distance away. Waiting is a skill photographers learn. It teaches you patience. It teaches you where the world will reveal its good secrets and its bad ones. The camera recorded for 3 nights. In the lab, the footage showed a slow approach from a distance. It's not a sprint, a study. The form halting at the edge of frame, turning its head as if picking up a sound, as if learning how we do that small turn. I began to catalog the gestures I recognized, A hand raised just so, and then dropped, tilt of the head that matched Mike's. In the time-lapse, the imitations were clumsy at first, and then gradually smoothed. That is the process of learning. A child learns to tie a shoe over time. A machine learns to produce a face by scanning millions of other faces. These figures were intermediate learners. The path from being light to being an imitator suggested architecture and patience. Something about that made me feel watched in a way I had not felt when the first photograph popped up on the screen. Back at home, the world narrowed. I stopped going on assignment. I could not let the camera snag me in a moment of unprotected life. But life requires small exposures: a shower, a nap, a moment of unconsciousness. I kept cameras in my studio on low, and once, in a lapse of courage, placed one by my bed. The image that came back the next morning was a frame I now replay in my head as if playing a slow, obscene film. It showed my sleeping form, and in the corner, a figure whose outline suggested the shape of Sarah. The figure looked not through me, but around me, cataloging, learning the topology of my sleeping position. The final phase of this experiment reads like a confession. I stopped telling people everything. I compartmentalized. Gave the police a folder and told Aoife some truth and some lies. I kept a private ledger in which I wrote down a simple rule: do not teach them to be human. But the rule is harder to keep when your livelihood requires you to watch and to show what you see. The camera is both the means and the temptation. I booked a small cabin not far from the coast, a place where light came in measurable slices, and where you could see the aurora when it chose to be generous. I went with one technician who could be trusted and nothing else. We set cameras in a ring as if building a classroom. I refused to sleep there, choosing instead to keep vigil in shifts. The technician kept watch on his laptop while I conducted the same gestures I had used during the staged lessons. Small human mechanical cues, but I refused to do them endlessly. I could feel the habit forming in my hands. On the third night, one camera beeped. I checked the feed and watched a figure approach with the slow deliberation of someone learning how to walk again. The outline moved not at random but with the geometry of our practice. The figure paused in front of a bundle that contained a jacket with my scent, a thermos with Mike's dent, and a pair of gloves I had left accidentally. It lifted the jacket as if learning what cloth felt like. The motion was clumsy, affectionate in a way. It mimicked the light catch you get when you turn a wrist. We made recordings in which the figure attempted to emulate laughter by coughing into the atmosphere and replicating the head tilt. It practiced the pause we human beings use before a joke. It sampled the way breath leaves a throat before a sentence. The technician and I watched, and the floor under me felt like shifting sand. At one point, the figure did something I had not expected. It lifted something fashioned from frozen mist and placed it neatly where my camera had been. In the next frame, the object was the precise shape of my lens cap, dent and all. Whoever or whatever the figures were had been cataloging the world with patience. What happened next is the part that has not been resolved, and that I will not pretend to fully understand. The technician recorded a sequence where more than one figure moves simultaneously. They do not move in unison the way soldiers do. They moved like a choir that had learned to match breath and timing from a teacher. They practiced human cadence. One of them, thin and taller than the rest, mimicked a gesture exactly the way Jake would have. It moved its head just as Jake did when he listened for an animal in wind. It stood and held the jacket like a man holding the weight of a memory. We stopped the playback. We went outside. There was nothing but night. The aurora braided above us, indifferent. I went home that morning with a tape in my bag and a lightness in my chest that felt like collapse. I thought that if I had evidence in hand, if I had a recording that showed a process, learning, imitation, then we could study it, name it, and perhaps stop it before it became habit. I did not know habits are hard to halt. They are like trains. Once the track is laid, the train runs. 2 months later, a video appeared on a forum. It was grainy but unmistakable. A frame from one of our nights, but now edited with new angles. The editing had the sensibility of someone who wanted the phenomenon to look sympathetic. The figures had been rearranged in poses that interpreted human emotion. A tilted head, a hand against a cheek. Comments poured in. People made up names. The internet supplied allegories. That video made the phenomenon a thing you could fetishize. It made them dolls. I was furious at the editing and at my own hand in teaching them, but that fury was mixed with a dread that felt like a forecast. If the public could shape their image with a click, then their public image could be learned as easily as a gesture. They would learn to appear certain things to us, so we would approach them the way we approach friends. That thought was the closest thing I had to a moral terror. The last image that I recorded that I am willing to share in a sober way is the one that sits on the edge of the things I can still claim to be private. It was taken months later in the attic of my childhood home. I'd left the camera running over